speaker, who's Gaye Donaldson. If you haven't got a drink, or can you gather round? That'd be lovely. Thank you. So, lovely Gaye, thank you for coming. I mustn't do this, my daughter said. I'm going to sit back. Right. Gaye has been a follower of the systemic constellation work, which we will explain. I know some of you here know all about it. Since 1994, training extensively in both family and organisational work. She worked directly with Bert Hellinger in the 90s, who was the man that initiated the whole movement, and he started it all. Having been managing director for many years of the Centre for Systemic Constellations, Gaye is now the creative director. She's also a humanistic counsellor. She travels nationally and internationally, facilitating workshops and teaching, has worked in Lebanon with healing the wounds of history and addressing the roots of violence. And her early career was spent in the organic food and farming sector as Director of Public Affairs for the Soil Association, as well as being a mother to 5 grown-up children and an extremely delighted grandmother of 3 little ones. It's a full life, and there's more. But she wants to talk about the magic of making the invisible visible. I mean, I'm not going to guarantee this because we could go anywhere, but these are a few possible. How we can live from an undefended heart, but from the place of resilience. Perhaps we don't need to armour up, and is vulnerability our greatest protection? So those are just a few ideas, but we might go anywhere, Gaye, correct?
We could, because I've forgotten we've even talked about those.
So how is your heart right now, and what is it telling you to talk about?
It's not really telling me anything, but it's quite full and poignant. A very dear friend died 2 days ago, so I mean I'm really with that, and it's been for me it's been a summer of exploring grief, so there's a lot of grief around, so the fact that there's been a very recent death in my life, I don't feel that my heart tells me things in a way, it doesn't tell my head things, but my heart more holds a sensation and an experience of fullness or emptying. It's more of a dynamic form than a mouthpiece for anything else, I think.
So how do you hear that movement? How does it get translated into sense and meaning for you?
I think I'm just aware in terms of how I experience myself, of the presence, the absence, the potency, the quality of the heart. It's like it's the nature. It informs the nature of how I'm paying attention, how I'm showing up, rather than, I don't know, it's very interesting because I've been thinking about it as you talked to Dan. I'm wondering what my relationship with my heart really was. How do I experience it? But it feels like an experience of being, rather than a source of information.
So do you
it's
think,
like it's the colour or the quality of what's here now.
do you think, therefore, if we've so separated out the mind, the heart and the body, that actually we've developed a vocabulary around it that is a misconception, and actually it's about sensing into life in its fullness?
I think it is. And the certainly in the work that I do, in the systemic work that I do, the foundational principle of systemic work is inclusion. And there's a lovely phrase that we use all the time, which is that what we reject, we bind ourselves most closely to. So if we're speaking from a divided head, heart and body, in fact also in our work we give a lot of, we place a lot of focus on the soul as another dimension of knowing. But if we're separating out head, heart and body immediately, instead of being present and here now, we're separating and dividing ourselves in a way that affects our inner experience. So
I don't want to spend a long time talking about what constellation work is, but I sort of feel that in order for it to make sense, we need just a little bit so that we can then move on from it. Is that all right?
yeah, it's all right. I mean, in essence, what constellation work is all about is finding the story that's big enough to make a difference. And what I mean by that is that what we recognise in our work, in a whole system approach, is that everything that we do and are and where we came from is nested in a story that gets bigger and bigger. So constellation work looks at what belongs to us and what belongs to other aspects of our system. We see ourselves more as an element in a metaphor might be a baby mobile. So we're one element within the whole. So in terms of a family system, we're inseparable from all the events, as you've just been talking about. We're inseparable from all the others who are present in our life and all the events that have occurred, not just in our lifetime, but also transgenerationally. Because we see that what would threaten to overwhelm a trauma or an event in somebody's life that might threaten or overwhelm them, what we tend to do in the service of survival is go round it. But in a systemic, from a systemic perspective, what we see is that whatever we exclude or avoid, it's picked up somewhere else in the system.
I just want to reference the fact that Dan, in a way that's what Dan was saying, I don't know where he is, that we have a tendency to avoid and bypass. Yeah. And what you're saying is, in bypassing, we are not allowing the system to heal in its holistic way.
Yes, but we have to be really careful that we don't bring judgment to that. Mm-hmm. Because the first priority of every system's such a horrible word, isn't it?
I know. What else can we say?
No, I've been grappling with this. I've been teaching this for years and years, 20 years. I'm still not come up with a better word. But survival has to come first. So, what's interesting is how we build sufficient capacity and resource in order to be able to face into what we need to see and include. That's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that we all collectively need to address so that we can have these, amazing conversations which help us to feel connected and human, and they open the heart, as you're talking about. Just listening to Dan was amazing. It's just lovely to hear somebody speaking in that way, and it changes us, doesn't it? So, but how can we resource ourselves to have the courage to have that level of honesty, speak out our truth in that way? It's a big question.
What aspect of your own personal story led you down the road to understand a systemic approach to life? And we talk about systemic thinking, but what is systemic feeling?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a juicy question. I was in therapy. I was adopted as a baby from a mother and baby home. I was a bought baby. So at the time, Pre-Adoption Act, that you could make a donation and choose the child from the home. And obviously in later life, there were all sorts of things that I needed to sort out. But the therapist I was seeing at the time used to say to me every 2 or 3, 4 weeks, tell me about adoption. And I say, no, it's all the shit that happened after that. Adoption, I'm fine about being adopted. And then in '93, he said there's a new sort of therapeutic modality that's just arrived from Germany. And it was, I think, the first or second workshop in this country. And he sent me. And on the second day of the workshop, I was the only non-therapist in the room. And the facilitator said, "Is there anyone who's adopted?" And I realised then I'd been set up, but I didn't actually realise that. But I sort of very tentatively put up my hand, and we did a constellation where I for the first time in symbolic form, I'm not going to go into how we did, but I met my natural parents, you know, in this symbolic way that we work. And in that moment I realised that everything in my life that was sort of out of order and causing all sorts of repercussions in my life was to do with being adopted. And this absolutely fundamental separation from any sense at all of where I came from, or a sense of connection with anyone or anything behind me. I mean, to such an extent that when my first baby was born, I remember telling people, I mean, she was born at home, I knew she was mine, but I used to tell people she was adopted. They would say, "Oh, that's a lovely baby," and I'd be breastfeeding her. I say, "Oh, she's adopted," and then everything in my mind would get completely confused. And she was the first human being I'd met who I was genetically connected to. And what I realised was that in the way we have a filing cabinet, you know, with telephone and gas bill or whatever in the label, there was nothing in my inner story that related to genetic connection. And so I had nowhere to put the information that this was my genetically connected baby. And you know, it began there. I suddenly started to recognize the fact that this severance of connection with the story in my bones was having a really profound effect, not just on me, but on how I related to my own children. You know, and the disconnection I felt with my past was there already in my arms as I held my babies. You know, that the story was carrying on, and that I couldn't make that bridge between them.
And the grief that you're talking about feeling right now, is there a thread between all of that and now?
I mean, I think so. I had a brother who was adopted from the same home, so we came from the same mother and baby home, and we didn't bond with our adopted parents at all. I mean, there's a whole story there. But we very much bonded together, and we had our own secret language and extraordinary, wild, feral life together as children. And he died in a motorbike accident when I was 18, he was 19. And this summer has a whole series of circumstances took me to a place where for the first time, 43 years later, I had the capacity, really, the resources to begin to grieve him. And there were a number of shocks and events that happened to do with a love affair that was getting incredibly painful, that took me to a place where I realised I needed to face into grief that for 43 years was too great and would have certainly overwhelmed me. So I'm sitting with that at the moment, fully. I mean, it's been a big journey, and I realised that at the time of his death, there was a lot of shock. He died, I don't know how to say it, but in a motorbike accident. So it was very sudden. And I faced his death in a way, and then shut the door. But what I'd never managed to find the strength to do was to grieve his life and grieve what he'd meant to me, and to grieve the active principle of our connection. And talking of open hearts and undefended hearts, and grief is a thick fog sometimes that wraps around the heart. It's not, it can be a completely impenetrable barrier, but it's also, there's something else that happens, I think, in the body. What certainly happened for me, which took me to a very foggy place inside, sort of cold, foggy place. And it's been a big summer, and then my first love died 2 days ago. So there's, I feel pulverized, but strangely the better for it. In the dissolving of the defences that I've carried for so long around grief, what's also dissolved is my sort of warrior structure, and that's actually rather amazing. So I'm feeling the benefits of.
Do you think that all occurred because someone came into your life who wants to love you?
You're getting really near the bone. How brave do you want me to be? It's only because I'm not looking at anyone else I'm even going here. I mean, it's certainly. But there's something too about how we long. We long for what we know we need, don't we? And then we get a little taste of it. And it's how strong the longing is as to whether we can bear to risk trying something again that might hurt us. Revisiting places of pain that cost us so greatly. How do we find that courage to love again?
So love and grief are two sides of a coin.
Love and loss, love and fear of loss, most of the time. Isn't it? I mean, thank God most people don't die, but the ones that do, the ones that leave us, can be so consequential. We shut down to everything else.
I'm trying not to listen to the drama lesson at the same time. I don't know if anyone else is, but they're getting quite active. Can you hear? I don't know what this tells us about life, that's going on at the same time. If we were in an improbable workshop, Red, we'd be including it, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
We'd be saying it's part of the system. Is that what systemic work would say as well?
I would definitely say that. We've got. I mean, maybe we can go to the depths of the foggy pain of grief, because life is so vibrantly included out there. It's like having the counterbalance. We can go down here because it's being held up there.
Which was also what Dan said. He said if we can hold that pain at the same time as dancing and singing and kissing girls and all the rest of it.
I loved all those kissing. I love learning how to kiss. I thought I must do more of that.
Oh gosh. There's so much to talk about with you, I don't know where to go.
How's your heart, Polly?
That's where you're happiest, isn't it? A number of times I've cried in front of you. That's a very good question. It's not bad right now, but I think since COVID, there's been a lot of grief, and there's kind of global grief as well as personal grief, and there's been a lot of grief coming out of lockdowns that seems to have reverberated beyond the lockdown, which I'm not sure that many people have talked about as well. So I feel things a lot all the time, every day. I cry a lot every day. And for me, it's an actual mechanism of survival. It's a means of allowing the feelings to come up and just let them out. And so it's not necessarily referencing a particular emotion. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's literally like a wave of almost like I'm going to be sick, and then I have to just cry, and then whatever the stress or whatever is out, and my heart feels much happier once it's out. And happier is a sense of peace, I think. Just, you know, my body relaxing and feeling okay. You're so clever. You distracted me. Did we ever answer the question about systemic feelings and what that actually means?
Well, one of the things, if you're working systemically, one of the things that we do is we distinguish between the feelings that belong to us and the feelings that belong in other aspects of the system, of the family system. So when we're working transgenerationally, what constellation work does that's very different from psychotherapy or one-to-one work is we recognize that we get entangled in events in the past, but also that we carry unresolved, unfaced, unprocessed, if you like, feelings that belong to other people. We can live our life expressing our grandmother's pain as if it's our own. And constellation work is really, it's about housekeeping, it's putting back what belongs where and staying clear about what's ours and what's not ours. So systemic feelings, is it mine, or is it something that I'm carrying on behalf of the whole system that couldn't be felt at the time because it might overwhelm the capacity of the people then to survive?
Can you just give an example so we can understand how someone carries on behalf of?
System. There's lots and lots of constellations. Do you want a constellation story?
Sure.
Let me think of one. There's one actually that's quite good. There was a guy an older man who came to one of my workshops, and he didn't look the type. You know, there isn't really a type, but there is kind of a type. And he didn't look like the type that would be at a constellation workshop. He was kind of in perhaps his early 60s, and he looked a little uncomfortable, but was clearly desperate enough to be there. And when he came to do a piece of work, he said that he had made a lot of money in his 20s, had a very successful business, but then had gone bankrupt, and had started another business that was equally successful, but had also gone bankrupt. And that he was currently riding high on his third business that was doing extremely well, but he could feel in his bones that things were about to go wrong. And somebody had suggested coming to sort of explore it through constellation work. And so I asked him a bit about his past, and he said that his father was a self-made businessman and who'd been incredibly proud of him, and you know, and I said, what about your mother? He'd almost forgotten he had a mother, I think, but he said, he paused and said his mother had arrived in this country in 1938. She was Jewish and she was escaping the Nazis and all that was about to happen, and that her immediate family and her as a child had survived, but all the rest of her family had died in the Holocaust. And we did a constellation on this, and what was clear, really clear, was that his loyalty to his father took him on the journey of making a lot of money. But, you know, we come from a mother and a father, and the stories of both families are carried in our blood and our bones. And when he was loyal to his father's story, he was disloyal to his mother's story. His family had lost everything. So in making a lot of money, he was close to his father, but in order to be close to his mother, he had to lose it. And so the pattern continued down the generations, where he managed to be both his father and his mother's son by making money and losing money. So we represented, again, too complicated to explain, but we represented his mother's family and all those in her family who died. And he went and met and wept and grieved and saw and acknowledged and gave a place to all of them. He didn't come back, so he either thought it was completely weird or it worked. But that's a systemic feeling. So we're carrying impulses and inexplicable desires or patterns that inform our choices at an utterly unconscious level, that attend to our belonging to our wider system.
So one of the things you said to me is you wanted to explore the dance of the invisible made visible, which is what your work is in many ways.
Yeah.
What do you still want to explore about the dance of the invisible made visible?
What really interests me
Yeah.
these days is how, I mean, we talk about embodied knowing, and we're brought up to think of ourselves, our sensory capacity, as sort of really being defined by the five senses, five bodily senses. But it's actually a rather incomplete model when it comes to our perceptive capacities. And Rudolf Steiner talked about the 12 sense model, which is starting to get big enough for us to begin to experience all of who we are and all of what we can do as human beings. But we work in constellation work in this spaciousness around us that we call the field, which has an innate intelligence of its own. It's also consciousness. It can also be called God, if you like, a small g, or love, or the description that I use around consciousness is it's life's love of life itself. It's life wanting life in everything. And it has a kind of intelligence, but it's beyond delineated physical reality. So as children we're brought up to identify this as a sofa and that is a table, and you are Polly and I am Gaye. But actually when we really feel our heart, as you talk about it, or we're informed about something that deeply touches us and moves us, when we feel complete inside, it's often because we're including the wisdom of the field around us. We're including another quality of our sensory capacity, our perceptive capacity, that actually takes us to a different experience of ourselves. So,
can I bring up what happened to you the night before your dear friend died? Because that feels like the ultimate sensory experience.
I don't know. I mean, you can. I don't know whether that's. I don't know. I mean, it was only 2 nights ago. It was difficult to interpret, but certainly I couldn't sleep. And this first love, who'd been very ill for 12 weeks, I had an experience of meeting him, and it was so vivid and sort of slightly other dimensional, whilst at the same time it felt utterly true, utterly here. It wasn't a ghostly, wafty thing. It felt like a very direct meeting, and it touched me very deeply. It felt like he'd come to say goodbye, actually, and I didn't know if he'd died or not. I sort of assumed he had. But why do you want to know about that?
Because I'm bringing it back to your own embodiment, and because that is something that we don't talk about in daily existence, and yet many of us have experiences that we would term invisible, made visible by talking about them in a way. And it's so linked to your grief and your love, which was how we started this conversation. Yeah. And it felt like a coming back full circle, because you've explained the kind of the study that you've done throughout your life. You told us where you came from and the study that came out of that, and then very recently you had this experience and how your heart is dealing with a lot of grief. So for me it felt very relevant.
I do have experiences of crossing the realms, if you like, or the different dimensions of knowing, that feel very enriching. And I think these perceptive capacities are really important right now for humanity, because I don't believe we're able to build a new society, a new world that is so desperately needed on every level, environmentally, socially, politically, even economically. I mean, we're going to have to come up with something brand new, and we can't really lean into the old paradigms in order to create where we need to go now. We've got to start with a new, with a blank sheet of paper. And in our work, we distinguish between two dimensions of future. We meet two dimensions of future, and one is our planned future, which we feel in control of, that we send out ahead of us, in our lists and our ideas and our plans for our life. But then there's another dimension of future, which is the emergent future that's coming towards us. And we can only really face that and receive the qualities and the insights that brings if we're conversant with and we're happy to work with the unseen dimensions of knowing. If we're too anchored
in the visible,
we're not going to be able to dream big enough or sense wide enough to really hear and know what's coming towards us, and how life wants to express itself through us collectively in this next bit of, a huge challenge for humanity. Huge.
I've gone over time already, haven't I? Well, I know there's a huge amount there, but yeah. Any questions?
I was very intrigued by this, you saying that you met your parents at this, or you encountered them, or you met them somehow at this first time when you learned about.
Symbolically.
I had this image that you sort of drew a pentangle on the floor and somehow conjured, or you collectively, somehow it sounded like a sort of magical thing. I just wondered how that happened.
Oh, this is a bit about my work I was hoping to avoid, because it gets all a bit wacky. But the way in which constellation work happens is that we set up elements or people in a system in a symbolic way. So we would have a group of people and choose somebody to what we refer to as represent. So what happened was that the facilitator said, choose somebody to represent your father, your blood father, and choose another person in this room to represent your blood mother, and two others to represent your adoptive parents, and one for your brother. And as I entered that configuration, there was nothing really magical about it. It was all quite, present. But our bodies are very sensitive to sort of spatial dimensions and to presence and absence of things. And so the experience of meeting, in massive inverted commas, my blood parents, albeit symbolically, but actually in embodied form, was hugely impactful, because it changed my inner story of coming from nowhere. So suddenly there were two people, I knew they weren't my parents. I wasn't going into some sort of, you know, crazy state of mind. But the presence of these two people brought the reality of the physicality and the truth of their place in my life home to me in a way that talking wouldn't have done.
That completely makes sense.
Yeah,
You need a modelling character.
yeah.
I presume you talk to them, or you say,
There
you
were-
somehow interact with them.
Yes, and there's a sort of reorganisation that happens to find the right place for everybody.
Because there's always been an absence and something that wasn't
Yeah.
present.
But there's some, I mean, you know, there was some very odd things that happened when I was, I mean, that experience occurred when I was, I don't know, about 30. But when I was 23, I'd gone to Ireland with a group of organic farmers, and we'd gone to a conference, and as my feet touched Irish soil for the first time as we got off the boat, there was like a tsunami of grief that came up my body. And I was the only woman in a group of 5 organic farmers. They were all men, and I was so ashamed. In fact, I just couldn't stop crying. And I was just apologising through my tears and my sobs, saying, I'm so sorry, I have no idea what's going on with me. I'm so sorry, this is so embarrassing. They're going, what on earth's going on? And it wasn't until I was 38, so many years later, that I traced my natural father. And you know, he's Irish. And my great-grandmother had left Ireland pregnant, illegitimately, and had begun a story that I was the 4th generation of children being given away in that family. And my body knew I'd gone home as I stepped off the boat, you know, whatever, I can't do the maths, but about 15 years before I knew what that story was. So, you know, the fact that we carry these stories in our bones is not a myth, or it's not fanciful. You know, it just felt this weight of homecoming that took a long time. And the other weird thing was that my daughter, who was 15 at the time, I called her 2 names, with the same names that my great-grandmother from Ireland had called her first 2 children. So first and second name of my daughter were the same as the 2 names of her. And we just couldn't make it up. Just totally weird.
It's just a quick question about constellation. Is it always someone like you and people representing your family, or is there ever a benefit to have any of the willing family members come and look at it together?
It's sometimes great to have couples come, particularly if the issues around the couple dynamic. We don't tend to work with parents if their children are present in the circle, because a lot of what the work is about is disentangling the way we carry, you know, we inappropriately carry our parents' issues or our grandparents' issues. And it's not family therapy as such.
That's
because
what I was wondering.
yeah.
How much could it be a way of acting out family therapy, or is it not that?
No, it's not that. It's much more like the way in which it works is that, to come back to the metaphor of the baby mobile, if one person in a family or an organisation or whatever it is comes and does a constellation which really touches them and they see something that impacts them deeply, then they change. And in changing one element of a baby mobile, you change all the others. So what often happens is that somebody will do a constellation and their family members don't know about it, but somebody outside of the group has no idea the constellation happened, will get back in contact after 20 years, or will, something significant will happen. In other words, there's evidence that the energy of the change in the work affects those who have no idea that the work even took place. And there's so much you know, it's been around now for 30 plus years. There's so much. I could tell you stories all night. Amazing news like that. So it's a way of doing family therapy without having to face the nightmare of being with your whole family to do it.
What was it about your own story that you think led you to get into the work that you now do?
What led me to become a practitioner was that my same daughter's cropped up a lot, you know, out of the 5 children. She had a major brain injury. She fell off a bicycle when she was 19, which my brother had had a motorbike accident and died at 19. When I traced my natural mother, when I was 28, her brother had died by being killed. My brother died because his motorbike hit a coach. My mother's brother, little brother, had died by being hit by a coach. My daughter had a bicycle accident at the same age my brother was when he died, and she was in a coma for a month and then rehabbed and lived. So she broke the transgenerational pattern, and it took about 1.5 years to sort of fully rehab her. And at that point, all the work that I've been doing for years felt meaningless. It had changed me. And then I was thinking, well, what am I going to do now? I've had enough monthly management accounts and running an organic business. And I realised that riding sidecar was constellation work. Yeah, and sometimes those huge events in life, they are, at the time they're terrible, but after you think somehow there was perfection in it. It was, everything happened as it seemingly needed to happen.
Well done. I have a question with listening to you and how lovely your voice is, and I'm embarrassed I haven't mine. And I wonder if you had a sense of the grief. You spoke about grief and you spoke about healing and having children and being a grandmother. I wonder, has your work been healing to you and sort of courageous and sort of hard for you, or has being a parent and a grandparent been courageous or healing, or which one has been more powerful for you in terms of thinking about all these different stories and experiences?
I think I was kind of compelled there were enough events in my life to keep me on course with therapy for a long time. Which is a mixed blessing, really.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to sort myself out. There was no choice, and I think that's sometimes quite good. It was so bad, basically, that there was no choice. I had children very, very young. I was 18 with the first, and so they sort of tumble, and my first daughter was conceived 3 months after my brother died, and she very much kept me in life. And then when she had her bike accident, I kept her in life. I saw her die twice on life support. We had a funny symmetry, the two of us, and she's now 42, and we're really working hard at the moment to separate, because we would share symptoms and all sorts of things. I'd say, is it your headache or mine? So, there's, I don't know, Dan, I think it's a bit of both. My children squirm with horror if I use words like trauma. Like, oh, fuck off, just stop it, just, oh, God, why do we have this shit? I don't know, oh, like that.
Has it been healing for you, like you said about the sharing that thing about my breastfeeding and then say, oh, my daughter's adopted? Do you feel like, having been now a mother and now being a grandmother, that has been healing in terms of you nurturing and finding a way of being, loving and creating a family of a genetic and a family of your own? that has healed something as well as all the work you've done?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I loved being a mum. You know, I really did, and it's been. I think it's been healing. Do you know, I'm tentative answering your question because I've got my children's voices in my head, who would really. I can hear them almost critically going, you know, well, we did it. It wasn't because of you. You know, there's all that sort of stuff. But I mean, for me, certainly, I had an experience of belonging as a mother with little children. That, you know, that glorious time when they look at you with nothing but love. It doesn't last forever. But you know, when they run to you and you're the sunshine of their life, it was incredibly reparative for me of the sort of the severance of things in my life, and just the joy of having children. But you know, we worry about also what they're born into. You know, and my daughter, she was at university in Brighton, and I remember she was in a shared house, and she phoned me once and said, there's a guy living in this house, and he's also the son of someone who's adopted, and we've been having great conversations, Mum, about what it's like to be the child of an adopted person. And I thought, blimey, guys, it's more than one generation. She can feel the gaps in me, even though I've been working hard to fill them in. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask you a question? Have your daughters had babies?
One daughter's got 2 babies.
So how did she describe her babies?
They're hers. In fact, the first one, you know. My first grandson, I think I got born just for him to be here. But then that's something weird that happens with grandmothers, isn't it? It's like you suddenly go, oh, that's the purpose of life. And the children are like your own children, out the way, just give me that one.
Yeah, hi Gaye. I know you well enough to know that you really only touched upon the extraordinary chaos of your life. And yet you sit there, unbelievably grounded. And I'm just curious as to how you have, I don't know, I'm so emotional, how you got, because your life has been unbelievable. And yet you sit there, wise, loving, compassionate. At what point?
It's okay, just let it come. Let it come.
At what point do you think the chaos began to turn? Can you actually identify a kind of a period of your life where the absolute carnage of the first 18 years began to surface?
I'm really not doing an advertising thing here, but it was constellation work that sorted me out, and it's not so much. It took me a long time to realise, even as a teacher, that we think we go and do the work. You know, I'd go to a workshop, I'd do a constellation for myself in the early days, and what I've come to realise now is that the work does us, and that life wants life within us. Life wants us to flourish. You know, it really does. It's like the field, the consciousness itself is benign. And if we can surrender, and my job puts me in a place where I'm sitting in that kind of space all the time, working with other people's families, but in that place where the all and everythingness of life is present, and it changes us. And I don't know that, you know, God, I've done every wacky thing on the planet to try and be sane and balanced, but I think ultimately it was what changed me was just being with and not trying to change, weirdly, and animals. which was always a lot easier to keep on.
What's the current horse count?
4. I've got 4 Icelandic horses in a little Icelandic herd, and they're much less trouble than people.
Are they part of the constellation?
Yeah, for expenses purposes, yeah. They're just lifesavers of connection.
Are we done? Thank you, everybody. I think we're allowed to hang about for a bit. Is that right, Kieran? A little bit. If you do want a drink or you want to chat, but if you're ready to go and you need some air, please feel free. Either way is good. And thank you. My darling.
This
Right.
is quite good because it's like
Yeah,
a block.
it is, isn't it? A physical block, I know. Let me just turn this on.